I'm Jez Benton, and this is Route to the Top. I'll be meeting with a whole range of leaders. We'll climb a mountain together and do a video podcast from the summit. In this episode, I've travelled to Dutch Hill, Vermont, and I'm with Sam Sidiqi, who is the chairman of an organisation called the Silk Road Mining Company. You want to start from the beginning, wind the clock back to how you ended up in the USA doing what you're doing?
Yeah, so I was born in 77, and I say that because I was born in Afghanistan, and that was kind of right when things got active with the USSR. So my mom's an American, she was there with the Peace Corps, but she'd married my dad, and my sister and I were both born in Afghanistan. We were going to stay there. But then there was a communist coup before the Russian invasion, and at that time, it just wasn't a good time to be an American in Afghanistan. Right. So my family at that time left. And we were lucky enough to be able to easily move to the United States. And so I grew up in a little town called Swarthmore outside of Philadelphia. And, good public school experience, a lot of the American dream, just having all these opportunities presenting themselves to me. And I was lucky enough to be able to go to MIT. So I did my undergrad at MIT, spent a year in Egypt with the Fulbright program. Then I worked for Bain & Company in consulting, which is another kind of great educational experience.
I won't hold that against you, it's fine.
And then I went to Wharton Business School, where I did the Lauder program to focus on Arabic. Because I had this interest in working in the Middle East. I knew Afghanistan really wasn't possible because the Taliban were in charge of Afghanistan in 95 when I graduated. And working in Iran, where I could also use Farsi, also wasn't an option. Those are not allies of the US at the time. And so I said, well, why don't I go to the region? So I studied Arabic in college, and I studied Arabic again while at business school. And so then after I finished business school, I went out and started to work in the Middle East.
And what was the calling? I can make my assumptions. You're born in Afghanistan, your parents are international people, etc. But where did that interest come from without me making the assumption that that's what it is?
Yeah, I think, when you grow up and you look a little bit different from people, and you're different in some ways, you try, it becomes part of your identity without knowing what it means.
Right.
So you sometimes want to learn about it. So I not everybody does, but for me it was a calling to learn more about where I was from, and I was interested in history, and so that just became part of my calling to learn more about it. And then when I went back, the first time I was in business school was the first time I went back to Afghanistan. I went to basically teach the new people at the central bank like how to use computers.
And what year was that?
This would have been 2002, 2003, in that range.
Right.
Probably summer of 2003. And I got to see my family there. And one of the things that struck me was I had a cousin there, a few years younger, and he was certainly just as smart as I was, a lot of capability. But because of where he was born, the fact that he had to move to Pakistan as a refugee for a while, come back to Afghanistan, because the opportunities that were there during the Taliban, he didn't have the chance to educate himself.
Right.
And so I said, look, why don't I think about that more, right? So if I have all these opportunities that, created this American dream for me, what can I do to kind of create more opportunities for Afghans so that more of them have opportunities?
Yeah.
So that became the push.
That became the push. Okay. Yeah. It's and how many times have you been back and forth to Afghanistan? It's obviously not an easy place to travel to. And
well, that was one of the nice things about living in the Middle East is I could get across more often. Yeah. So I went once in 2005 for a cousin's wedding and to do some business, and then in 2009 I actually got my passport and moved there.
Okay.
So I lived there for a couple of years. And it was that experience kind of working for a logistics company, but living in Afghanistan, that kind of created the set of connections. I was still young enough that I could make friends,
Yeah.
As you get older, it's harder to make those close friends. But I was able to make some really close friends and start to feel more of an attachment for the place. And that's when I came up with the idea of Silk Road Mining.
Right.
I met with the Minister of Mines, and he talked about the possibilities. And the U.S. government had support, and the World Bank had supported the Afghan government to create a tender process. I said, well, there's nobody here doing it. Everything else is so corrupt. Why don't I build a company to focus on mining? Because it's something that's not corrupt yet, and it's something that takes a long-term vision. And most of the corrupt businessmen were focused on short-term opportunities.
Yeah.
So I was, okay, this is my opportunity. Let's try and do it. So that's when I founded Silk Road. Was in 2012.
2012. Okay, so 12 years ago. Yeah, I mean it's funny. I'm winding the clock back a little bit to sort of MIT, Wharton, Bain. You know, that's you do that bit, and I sit here and go, yeah, that's kind of the American way. You'll go into consulting for a bit, maybe you jump over to the client side for a bit, and then, you know, end up running something here. But that choice to make ultimately what is a much harder decision. There's 5 roads you could take. There's probably 4 fairly straightforward ones for a person with your background and skill set and all the rest of it, and you choose the tougher.
There's also kind of an intermediate thing to think about, which is the rest of my experience in the Middle East. So when I went to Egypt with the Fulbright program, and I compared that later with my experience at Bain, we were doing good work for big companies, but your advice might change the share price of a company a few percentage.
Yeah.
And that effect might happen 2 or 3 years later after the board realizes you gave them advice. So you didn't get the tangibility of it, which is fine for some people, but for me, I wanted something a little more tangible.
Well, and you also weren't responsible for executing on it, right? You get to walk away, and it's very different.
And you know, certain richness to the consulting experience, but that other thing that I wanted. Whereas when I'd been in Egypt, I noticed that I was a very unique asset, right? That there weren't as many, let's say, MBAs from Wharton there. And so I thought, why don't I go to the Middle East and see if I can differentiate myself?
Yeah.
So I ended up joining a Kuwaiti company coming out of business school. And within 3 months, I had been assigned to work on a $400 million acquisition.
Right. And this is a real estate, was this a real estate business?
The logistics firm.
The logistics firm. Okay.
So it was a company that had some very good U.S. government contracts in Kuwait, supporting the Iraq War, actually. And they said, well, what should we do? How should we expand? They said, well, let's grow commercially. Okay. So I helped to acquire their first global freight forwarding network. And that acquisition later became a nice exit for them. So we bought it for about $400 million, and they sold it for more than $4 billion just a couple of years ago. But the opportunity was that here was this firm that could really use an MBA.
Yeah.
So it was able to kind of accelerate my development in certain respects. But instead of staying at the corporate level, I said, this kind of corporate M&A stuff, it's not that different from consulting in certain ways. You're still not deep in the business learning.
Yeah.
So I spent a number of years doing parallel transitions. So after doing the acquisition, I said, I'm going to go do integration. So I moved to LA, the headquarters of the company. And I said, this is still integration at a headquarters. So I moved into the European region. I became the assistant to the CEO there. I was the director of strategy and execution. So I learned for 3 years underneath the CEO Europe. But maybe that's a lower position than when I was doing M&A, right?
Right. But from an experience standpoint, it's just what you needed.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
And so then from there, I jumped into the Afghanistan opportunity. So I became the deputy country manager to a retired 2-star general working in Afghanistan. And then he left, and I became the CEO of Afghanistan. And then there was some kind of a contract dispute. We couldn't work for the U.S. government, so I ended up moving to India.
Right.
So this is a lot of movements for a young family. We moved so many times. And that's when I started to think about doing Silk Road. So I'd started Silk Road, and my boss in Kuwait said, hey, Sam, don't go back to the U.S., because my wife and I decided to go back to the U.S. ultimately. It was like, this was enough. We've seen all these countries. We've had these experiences. Let's go back. And I was actually going to go back and join another consulting firm in Philadelphia. But my boss in Kuwait, he said, Sam, don't go. Come here to Kuwait, let's chat. And he said, look, Sam, I will help you on the mine. We'll find the financial support for you in Kuwait. And actually, we also talked about building a ski lift in Afghanistan, because that was actually my dream.
Right.
So he said we were going to build a ski resort in Afghanistan.
We'll talk about that again in a minute, I guess.
But come to Kuwait.
Yeah.
And fix my uncle's company. So that's when I became CEO of the National Real Estate Company. It's listed in Kuwait. It has about $2 billion of assets.
Yeah.
And it was the largest shareholder of the logistics company. So it was a turnaround opportunity. So at the age of 34, I got this chance to be CEO of a publicly listed company. And, you know, it gets to something that we'll talk about maybe later, which is that life is really contingent sometimes. There's really a lot of luck involved. So I had a certain amount of luck that I got assigned to the $400 million deal.
Right.
It happened to be just the right deal at the right time.
Yeah.
And then as I did these parallel transitions where I was learning, my career got a little bit stuck. I ended up being under some people and around some people in the later part of my career, which weren't good. And, but it was those negative people that made me quit.
Right. That led you to the next experience.
Created the opportunity for me to get this CEO position. So a lot of ups and downs. But that initial thesis, I think, was right, which was to go someplace where I was needed, right? So the Middle East didn't have, at the time, certainly there's a lot more now, but there weren't as many, let's say, MBAs going to the Middle East at that time.
Yeah. I'm going to pause right here, check the camera. Great. Yep, still rolling. That's good. So there's something about the unique skill set, finding a home for what would there be a unique skill set but somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Not be. So you said a lot of luck. I use the line, you sort of make your own luck. I like to think of it as not just pure luck, but there's something about it. So how conscious were you when making some of those big decisions that you were angling for something else, like trying to make your own luck, or was it, no, this just isn't working, it's time to do something different? Because I find a lot of leaders that are very sort of tuned into their own values find making those decisions could be quite difficult, or is this the right thing to do, that lean into that and say, for me the adventure has ended and I need to move on. That would be my reason, right? So one of my core values is definitely adventure. And if I'm doing something where the adventure just sort of ends, it's like, okay, I've got to go find something different to do. Actually makes that decision a lot easier for me to take.
Yeah. So we're social animals, and it's very easy to want to keep up with the Joneses, to see some people running and race against them. So you have to be really conscious about setting your direction if that's not what you want to do. If you want to race, you race. That's fine. So the first time where I had to think about it a lot was business school, because I'd come out of consulting, and in business school in the early OOs, it was still a big push to join a consulting firm, join a bank. Yeah. There were people who came to campus to recruit, and you feel like, I will validate myself by recruiting. Yeah. But because I was in the lauder program,
pay back the debt.
Pay back the debt, exactly. But because I had this lauder Arabic track and I'd committed myself to the Middle East, I just tuned that off. Right. So that helped me to avoid a path that wasn't what I'd wanted. Yeah. Whereas if I just kind of gone into business school and hadn't made that prior commitment, I probably would have just gone in that path.
And recruiters wouldn't have even known how to have that conversation with somebody if you go, no, actually, I don't want to take that path. Help me take this different path. They would be like, well, what are you talking about?
Exactly. And so then that led me into joining this Kuwaiti logistics company. And then it was just that commitment I'd made that, look, I left consulting to learn about business with my hands, and just kind of committing to going deeper and deeper into the business. Yeah. So that was helpful. And, then it came down to this chance of trying to build this thing in Afghanistan, or even going to Afghanistan in the first place. Yeah. Because, for my family, it wasn't an easy thing to leave Switzerland and move to Afghanistan. And so I had to really put a lot of thought into, what are the goals? What are these things I want to achieve in my life? Yeah. And if I don't do this now, when am I going to do it? And then just being comfortable taking that risk. Yeah. And I think sometimes it does help to know, what do you want to achieve in life, right? So if you are trying to achieve the most financial gain, maybe that would be a different set of decisions. I did have to achieve a certain amount of financial gain because I'm from a middle-class background. I had to pay back those loans you talked about. But once I was comfortable that those loans were paid off and I could live a middle-class life, and I said, well, why not take these risks? You can take some risks to achieve the bigger dream. Yeah. And so my brain when you talked about that, went to my family. So I have a wife, I have four boys, 15 down through 10. And I was just thinking about having that conversation
Right. Okay, so we're in Switzerland, and you know things are pretty good, and But I've got this itch I need to scratch. How does that conversation happen within a sort of family environment?
So I think the reality is I didn't start having children until later.
Right.
So my wife and I have a beautiful 8-year-old daughter, Jasmine. But this was before we had any kids.
Okay.
So,
but still,
it was still a discussion
yeah.
with my wife, and you know she was super supportive.
Yeah.
So she understood I had these dreams, and she was supportive on that. So, you know, it was in many ways too much to ask.
Yeah.
But she said let's do it and supported me on that.
Yeah. Well, you've still made other big decisions.
Yeah.
with a family. We'll get to Everest in a moment, which was going through my head, because I was when I made that decision to go climb Everest back in I made the decision in 2003, climbed in 2005. I was young, free and single pretty much. I had a girlfriend, but no wife, no kids, no negotiation with anybody. Just could go and do it, without any pressure on a system. You made that decision a couple of years ago, so we'll get to that in a minute, because I want to keep going down the road of just the amount of global and international work that you've done and time that you've spent overseas. I'm just thinking back over my last 12 people that I've interviewed. You are by a long stretch the most sort of globally orientated person that I've interviewed. So from a leadership standpoint, I'm really interested to know, how you show up differently in different contexts. From Switzerland to the US to the Middle East to Afghanistan. How does Sam think about being in those places and leading in those organizations?
Yeah, I think it's not always just about the country of origin. Even if you went from New York to Louisiana, you'd have a massive cultural change.
Yeah.
And that difference between New York and Louisiana might be more than the difference between New York and Dubai. And in a similar thing, it can also be the business line, right? So freight forwarders, especially European freight forwarders, are a certain type of individual, have a certain type of education, a certain, maybe international, but a certain very focused viewpoint.
Yeah.
And that's going to be completely different from consulting. So each time you travel across boundaries, you learn some sensitivities. There has to be a lot of listening. There has to be a lot of adjustment of language and empathizing. So for me, one of the biggest challenges, if I think about moving to Switzerland, is not only was I this American or Middle Easterner, as they saw me, coming to Switzerland, but I was also 27 years old in a senior position where all of my peers were in their 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
So you have to be...
And where were you? Geneva or Zurich?
That was in Basel, actually.
Oh, you're in Basel. Okay.
So you have to come in with a lot of humility,
Yeah.
right? Especially ex-consultants. It's an important...
Recovering,
important
they call
aspect.
us. They call us recovering consultants.
Because if you come in acting very smart, discounting other people, that's a sure way to lose your license to leadership.
Yeah. Not many 27-year-olds get that. I'm just saying. You're the same age there as I was when I moved to New York. I was 27 when I set foot into New York City and started to build the business that I ran there for many years. Not many people...
I may have made some mistakes along the way.
May have had some feedback.
Could have happened.
Me too. That's funny. But but even making those mistakes, getting that feedback and learning along the way is a process too.
Yeah, it is. And the Europeans were great. I learned a ton in Europe because there's a certain relationship between Europeans and the Americans. I remember the best praise I got while I was there is there were a bunch of Europeans sitting around the table making fun of Americans. It's like, hey guys, I'm here. They're like, oh Sam, we don't think of you American.
You don't count.
You're not American, Sam. It's okay. Like, okay, I guess I'll take that as a positive, considering what they were saying.
Yeah, that's right. So I basically don't identify. I identify as what? I identify as nothing, something. So that's one aspect, and then, in my second big career when I left. We talked also before about what is it like to transition and why do you transition. Yeah.
So to come back to that, I had really fallen in love with the logistics company I worked for, Agility. So when I did that acquisition, and then I moved to integration, and I actually helped acquire the brand name Agility. It was a small company in the UK that we acquired that became the brand name for the company. I felt a lot of ownership there.
Right.
And so it was a very difficult thing stepping away from that when you fully commit to a job. So that was, and I think that happens to a lot of people in their careers, is you see this, and especially I was working really, really hard, lots of hours, and that became such an important part of my identity. And so stepping away from that felt like a divorce in a way.
Yeah.
And that's part of when I started to think about, what do I want to get done? So if I have this identity separate from my company, what is it that is my identity? What do I want to do? And that's when I started to think more and more about, hey, what can I do for Afghanistan? That's why I was studying the Middle East, right? Because I wanted to do something for Afghanistan, and that led to the shift.
Yeah, you always had an angle to it, or a mind to it, or a toe in it.
Yeah.
So how tough is an early stage mining company in Afghanistan? I'm assuming it's minerals.
Yeah. So when you think about the different levels of mining, there's prospecting, where you just kind of go and try and find indications. And then once you have indications, you do exploration. And exploring is really about saying that we think something's here, but we have to prove that it's there and prove that it's economic.
Yeah.
And
there's enough of it.
Yeah, is there enough of it at the right height?
Yeah.
How costly is it to get it out of the ground? And then to transport it somewhere where they'll buy it at a reasonable price. So there's a host of risks.
Yeah.
And that exploration process is massively, massively risky. And then you compound it by working in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's right.
But on the plus side, what you have is the fact that we know that copper is massively important for the world, right? So if you think about a regular car, it might have 80 kilograms of copper. If you take an electric car, it could be 3 times that amount. So that's just one example, but you look at windmills, you look at solar, copper is massively, massively important for this green revolution. But a lot of the surface level copper mines in the world have been discovered, except that Afghanistan, nobody's been exploring it.
Right, yeah,
And
because it's been such a place fraught with difficulties.
Yeah, so I felt that being first, right, so we are the first large scale exploration license holder for minerals in Afghanistan. The Chinese have a project which is proven, so it's not an exploration license, it's an extraction license.
Yeah.
But we were the first large-scale exploration license. So I said, it's important for this to happen. So whether it's successful or not, I'm going to take that risk because we need good people to do it. And I also wanted to make sure that the people leading the charge for mining in Afghanistan were looking at it from a perspective of making sure it helps Afghanistan. Because there have been cases in Africa, for example, where a mining company would come in, turtle up, build the mine, and not really help the environment around it.
Right. So let's get stuck into Silk Road, mining, Afghanistan.
It's a risky thing.
It's mining and it's Afghanistan. I can imagine just getting anything done there is hard. So. Yeah, I mean, clearly you're not one to shy away from risk and a challenge. So why that kind of business?
So the reason for this kind of business is that if you look at Afghanistan, it's a landlocked country of 30, 40 million people. So real, let's say, manufacturing, anything like that, you need a big domestic market.
Yeah.
Or at a minimum, you need to be on the ocean to be able to export to a big domestic market. So as a landlocked country that's small, we're not going to be able to compete also as a latecomer. So what do we have as a country? There is agriculture. There will be, let's say, some transit trade, but there's a lot of limitations. So what do we have as Afghanistan? We have these minerals, and they're untouched. So how can I make sure that this new pillar of the Afghanistan economy is built up, and is built up in a way that really benefits Afghanistan?
Right, it's built out right for the better. Because I'm guessing over the years, others have tried.
So I mean, the Soviets tried a little bit to do some very early, not even maybe exploration, but more just kind of the base level searching, right?
Yeah.
But since then, there's been war. So most of modern mining has been going on while Afghanistan was in some form of war or another. So actually not many people have tried.
Okay.
And that was part of the opportunity. And so what my partner and I did is we said, listen, 20% of our equity, we are pledging it from the beginning. We will make that to develop the Afghanistan mining cluster. So we don't want the mine to just come in and turtle up and not benefit the people of Afghanistan. We want to make sure that Afghans are getting hired, Afghans are becoming engineers, and that the environment is being taken care of.
Yeah.
Right. We don't want to have a Superfund site like here in the U.S. where we've just destroyed the economy, the whole environment. So those were all important to why I wanted to get into mining, build the pillar for Afghanistan, and make sure that Afghans benefit.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess the environmental side, obviously, being outdoors people as we are, we have a certain level of respect for the wilderness. Here we are, beautiful
Exactly.
Vermont, nearly in the clouds. It's actually starting to snow right now, so that. Knowing that is on one hand, I mean, it's a beautiful country. I've stepped into it. I've literally gone. I'm in Afghanistan. I'm in Pakistan. Up on the mountain regions. But it's like you said. It's what's the business that's sustainable in the country, and not destroying it or getting dragged into what could be other, political issues or this, that, and the other in the country. Because what else does it have? So that must be a tough question to answer in as far as what other industries could I be working in there that could have an impact and, like you said, equity to the country and to the people. So that on the scale of things, that must be a thing that you concentrate on a reasonable amount.
Yeah, and there's no lack of challenges in it, right? There are political issues, there are difficult tactical issues, there's bureaucracy of dealing with the government, there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Right? It's but if we don't have challenges in life, why are we needed? Right? So let's take the challenges on.
Understatement en route to the top. I think that's probably the biggest understatement. So has it got easier or harder since the US pulled out?
So you have to say both.
Okay.
From the negative side, even though the US hasn't sanctioned Afghanistan, there were existing sanctions on individuals. And so the banks don't really want to have any risks. So the banks basically cut Afghanistan off.
Okay.
So there's this kind of unofficial international banking sanction on Afghanistan that makes it very difficult to move money. And that kind of scared off investors.
Yeah.
So that was a big kibosh on things. On the positive side, we have to understand that the previous government of Afghanistan was quite corrupt. And so there was a lot of short-termism.
Yeah.
People knew, let's say maybe a lot of people knew that they weren't planning to stay in the country. So they would try and get these government positions for the short term to make money and get out.
Yeah.
And that's not useful to deal with when you're planning for a 20, 30, 40, 50 year mine.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was very difficult. And it was also very difficult that the Taliban controlled certain areas and the Afghan government controlled others. So that created a lot of security risks. So the positive today is that you have one government that controls all the territory. So it's less expensive to operate. And you have people in government who intend to stay there.
Right.
And so they're less likely to have this short-termism.
Yeah.
So that is what I would say the positive is. So it should be easier moving forward than it was, during a period of war.
Yeah. And I'm gonna walk and look at the camera just for my viewers. I'm gonna stop recording every time, but it's so cold here.
I'm going to really quickly also just stop my phone. Sorry about that.
It's so cold here that the camera keeps freezing. And again, for most of you that have watched many episodes of this, we just do this as two. So I don't have a crew and microphones and somebody behind the camera telling us that it's not working anymore. So if I have any feedback to Apple, it's put a green light on the back side of an iPhone so you can see if it's still recording. So yeah, I'm gonna keep popping backwards and forwards to make sure that we're actually filming what we're talking about. So the Taliban supportive of the work?
So I think that you have to understand where people are coming from, right? So during the war, the Taliban were actually better at taxing the mining industry than the Afghan government.
Right.
So,
Okay.
So there were a lot of, let's say, smaller scale mines around the country, and the Taliban would tax those, and it was an important part of their revenue stream. So they see it as important.
Yeah.
But that type of mine is very different from a mine that might cost $2 billion to construct that has $20 billion of minerals, right? There's an industrial scale mine versus small scale
Versus
mine.
small scale. Yeah.
And if you haven't, let's say, had the chance to work in government for a long time because you've been fighting a war, you're not necessarily ready mentally to understand how you govern that differently from these other mines that you have been governing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the mindset around
So
scale and things.
So there's a whole, let's say, educational process to learning all the different types of mines. How do you govern them? How do you interact with them?
Yeah.
And I'd say that they're open. They want to be supportive. They want to develop the country. But it will probably take some time just to get to that next level.
Yeah. Okay. Super fascinating. I can just imagine meetings and conversations and discussions and negotiations and how difficult that must be. Okay, so let's so I'm going to go back to something that you said earlier about you were saying 27 Switzerland, getting the feedback, making mistakes. What are some of the, you talked about listening and not assuming and stuff. What are some of the big strengths that you've had to leverage, particularly with Silk Road mining? As you sit there and go, okay, my skill set probably isn't mining, probably isn't exploration, probably isn't this. What is it? What's the core Sam Sidiqi skill set? When you rock up and you start working, what do people get?
I think the most important thing is being able to build up a team, right? And work with the teams that are available to get the mission done with a clear vision. So especially in a place where you might not have all the choices in the world, there's not a lot of mining expertise in Afghanistan. So it's really about just assembling the team, giving them a mission, and then staying with it and pushing forward. So there's a perseverance aspect to it.
Yeah.
The mining venture has been a roller coaster, right? So if you're running a day-to-day business, you know what your P&L is monthly or weekly or even daily in certain businesses, and that's a certain driver to have feedback. On the mine, when we finally got the award, which was itself a process, right? There was a competition, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of difficult things. Initially, we were second place on the two mines. We only got first place because somebody didn't pay their taxes. Again, it's quite contingent, right?
Yeah.
So that was a long roller coaster of up and down, and it was you'd get super excited, and then you'd feel super low because it would change from day to day. So just having and I probably learned this actually from Silk Road, just learning to not get too upset or excited about things, right? That this is a long process. The highs are not as amazing as I might think they are. The lows are not as dangerous as I think they are. And having a certain equanimity as I work through it. I think also that when I did have the chance to then become CEO of the real estate company in Kuwait, where I was running larger projects, it gave me a certain perspective, again, not to get too excited about the highs and too upset about the lows. You really have to have that when you're working on these kind of very risky ventures.
Yeah. About Everest.
Yeah.
My first question is a random one. As I was driving up, I was like, are you the first Afghan or the first Afghanistani? Because when I grew up in the UK, it was always Afghanistani in my mind. Okay. And then when I've read a few things, it's Afghan.
Yeah, we say Afghan.
You say Afghan, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
So yeah, I'm the first Afghan to summit Mount Everest.
Why did it take an Afghan so damn long? Because you only did it last year.
So even if you go back and you look at the first people to climb, for example, Matterhorn, it was Brits on vacation, right? Because
with long poles and Victorian dresses.
Why do people climb things? So there's a combination of economic, having the freedom, along with a certain skill set, right? So the Swiss climbers who were with them were quite strong and were an important part of getting to the top, but it took kind of the idleness of the rich British guy for it to happen. So in a country of war, if you had capability, there were just so many other things to get done. So there are plenty of Afghans in Afghanistan who could be much stronger than me physically. I don't doubt.
I mean, mountain people. I mean,
there's a lot of mountain people.
Yeah.
So, but a lot those mountain people don't have the economic capability to go do it,
yeah.
or the rationale of, hey,
Yeah.
why am I going to climb this thing? So it just kind of was a happy coincidence that I happened to be in a position to have the capability to go climb it, and kind of the willingness and some experience in the mountains to be physically capable.
Was it always something you wanted to do? When did your sort of climbing interest, mountaineering interest start?
When I first moved to Afghanistan, I took over part of the business from a Pakistani gentleman who became a close friend. And he had been to Concordia, which I'm sure you're very well aware of, and just spoke about it in such glowing terms. And he had actually traveled to Alaska to hike around Denali, not even to climb it. He wasn't that capable, but kind of a middle-class Pakistani guy put all of this effort into just going and seeing these mountains. And I was still young enough, and I was just so focused on my career. But as a young child, I'd been to Alaska many times, and I enjoyed the mountains.
Yeah.
I said, look, if I like the mountains, and this guy was able to put so much of his time and effort into it, why can't I do that? And then seeing the mountains of Afghanistan, I was there, stuck in a building because I wasn't allowed to go out for security reasons, but I could see the mountains around me. I said, hey, this is something where I can bring things together. I enjoyed skiing in Switzerland. I enjoy the mountains. Why should I be working this hard all the time and not allowing myself to do other things? So my first, the two mountains that were most important to me were actually Denali, because I'd spent so much time in Alaska growing up, and I saw that as a legitimate target for me. And Noshak in Afghanistan is the tallest mountain in Afghanistan, which is about 7,500 meters, probably in the top 50 mountains in the world.
Yeah, it's up
if
there.
Not the tallest.
Yeah.
So
what's that in feet?
In feet, I think it's just around 25,000 feet.
Okay, about 25,000, yeah.
So Everest, if I'm honest, once I climbed Denali, and I became the first Afghan national to climb it, I said, this will be, I think, really important for Afghans to see a positive story about Afghanistan, especially around that time.
Yeah.
So let me climb Everest in order to, send that positive message, but also to develop my foundation, Afghan Peaks.
Yeah.
So Afghan Peaks is about another economic pillar for Afghanistan.
Sure is. And I'm going to wander back over to the camera. You keep talking.
So if there's we talked about what Afghanistan has, its lack of capability to do manufacturing. It has, let's say, it will have mining once we build it up. It has agriculture. What else could it have? Well, it has these beautiful mountains.
It has unbelievably beautiful mountains.
And so if we can keep those mountains pristine, and we can start developing the human infrastructure to support a tourism economy, then in the future we can have this beautiful tourist experience that's benefiting Afghans. So Afghan Peaks is about developing Afghanistan's mountains in terms of sport, safety, and nature preservation. Sport right now is about mountain climbing and skiing, but I'm sure we can add mountain biking and other fun mountain activities. Safety is about avalanche education, and we've done some of that. And then nature preservation is to just keep the place beautiful, kind of like what Oman has done. Yeah. So that's really kind of how I started to think about Afghan Peaks. And Everest was a way for me to bring awareness to the world about Afghan Peaks and to raise money for Afghan Peaks.
Yeah. And how's it going? I saw a great post the other day on LinkedIn with a bunch of guys with what looked like handmade skis, getting ready to head down something.
So it was a tough couple of years at first. We weren't sure that the new government was going to allow this activity. Yeah. But we actually had a ski race even that first year. Didn't put a lot of money into it, just a little bit. And so then last year we got some funding from the Afghan Sports Trust, and we said, we'll just make the ski race a little bit bigger. I said, no, do something more interesting. So we said, what if we make some wooden skis? Because we knew the kids occasionally did these. Yeah. But we said, let's do more of them. So we hired local carpenters. So every dollar is going into the local community, and we made the 35 pairs of wooden skis for, $40 a piece, whatever it is, $50. And these kids are getting galoshes who didn't have them. Yeah. And now we have this little local economy of kids skiing around in these wooden skis.
Kids skiing around the mountains. That's awesome.
So we're doing it again this year. This year we've added a ski school, which we had before in the previous government, but the last 2 years we didn't have the funds for it. But we got some additional funding this year again from Afghan Sports Trust, We got a corporate sponsor in AWCC, Afghan Bisim, so it's the cell phone company. So they're sponsoring the race. So we're getting a lot of coverage, and kids are really excited. I'm very excited for it.
Yeah, it's so good to hear that there are sponsors out there and supporting it, because it could be seen, as a kind of frivolous, or what's the point, or just some outside money coming in, because it's such a massive place. I mean, the mountain region, I climbed a lot in Hindu Kush, Himalaya, and you just, we were on top of a 20,000 foot peak. We had a first ascent in 1995, top of a 20,000 foot peak, and it just is immense as far as the size and scale and scope of things. So starting, you've got a grassroots, start small, build some interest, get the kids involved.
And there's this concern about it being frivolous, especially at a time, when the banks cut off Afghanistan and all the foreign aid disappeared. There has been hunger, right? So there are real issues there. So although we have these ski schools and a ski race, a big part of the ski race is that we're feeding everybody on the mountain at that time.
Yeah.
We've also been raising money to do other food distribution. On the ski school, these kids are getting one meal every day.
Yeah.
So there is a certain element of getting certain basic humanitarian assistance at this time.
Through that.
And connecting that humanitarian assistance with this fun mountain
fun
sport,
well, that's the word, is fun, because from a health and well-being standpoint, we all know that if people are feeling healthy, having people feel more healthy when they're having a good time, enjoying themselves. It's not all work. It's play, and it's not just kicking a soccer ball around in the summer. It's getting out.
In a tourist economy, it doesn't have to be just foreign tourism.
Yeah.
So coming up with
absolutely.
the idea that, Afghan tourism counts, and even if it doesn't contribute a cent to GDP, if a little boy goes and has fun skiing in his backyard, that's a net positive.
Yeah, and interacts with people from the big city who have got different kind of jobs and are coming out to do something that might be a little bit weird and also a little bit cool to those guys. Exactly. I mean, it's you can just see the benefits of opening people's eyes to bigger things. On the drive up, we had a chat about Everest and sort of learnings from the climb. So we talked about, obviously, the first Afghan to climb Everest. Obviously, it was last spring. You'll have your first anniversary coming up soon. Anyway, I'm coming up to my 19th anniversary. It gets a bit embarrassing after. People go, "Oh, you climbed Everest? When was that?" And I say 2005, and they're like, "That's a really long time ago." You still have the freshness of things. So I'm after the sort of, I guess one of the interesting things for me on Everest was, from a leadership development background that I can't help but watch and figure out how things are being led. And my experience on Everest is a very unique environment because of the level of risk and how sort of leadership shows up in different contexts. So Everest for me was a very different context, and I experienced leadership like nothing else. In fact, Russell Bryce, who was my expedition leader, ran a company called Himalayan Experience, quite a famous New Zealander who's run a lot of expeditions up there, has quite the reputation of being a very gruff, direct, somewhat mean, not a team player, But that is his exterior, kind of. Once you actually got to know Russell and got to figure out why he was like that, which was actually all surrounding the well-being of his team, it kind of all became clear. Because you could just blame it on the context of safety, right, and risk. And I'm going to be very direct and mean and all the rest of it because your life is in my hands. So just do what I tell you, right? Versus somebody who's actually really tuned into the other teams and the mountain and the team itself and the guides and figuring out how to lead a team of quite ambitious people through that. So how was the sort of leadership experience for you on Everest?
Yeah, I think let's talk through one kind of very specific example kind of that happened to me, which was when I got sick, right?
Yeah.
Because then you see what happens when you have to make these real decisions. So when we went through the Khumbu icefall, I kind of did okay, felt all right. But of course we get up to this higher elevation, and I know I'm susceptible to higher elevation. So that next day, we're just kind of lounging around in Camp 1, but it's very sunny, and the sun's reflecting off everything, and we're just burning up in our tents.
Yeah.
So after a little while, me and my tent mate were just sitting in our underwear in our tent, with the flaps open, just like trying to not die. And maybe I got dehydrated or some kind of sun effect or the altitude, all these things, but the next morning I start vomiting. And I walk to Camp 2, which is kind of the easiest day, for sure, by far the easiest day, but I'm dragging, right? I go quite slowly into Camp 2, and I get there and I start vomiting again. Have a little lunch, vomit again. So by now, we're quite worried about how much liquid I have in me.
I was going to say, you don't have a lot of...
And later on, they didn't tell me then, but afterwards when we got down, my fellow hikers like, Sam, you looked like death that day. They were worried about me.
Yeah.
So I woke up the next morning, when we were supposed to go to Camp 3 in the Lhotse face, and every morning we're checking our S2.E2, which is your oxygen content in your blood, and my S2.E2 was below 60,
and it should be above 90.
So right now we probably have 98, 99.
Yeah.
As you go up in the mountains, your body adjusts to being lower, so it could be okay in the 70s.
Right.
It can be in the 60s a bit, but that 60s is bad.
Yeah.
You want to be in the 70s and 80s, and the best guys stay in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
So if it's below 60, that's a real issue. So we were at the cusp of me being turned around, and one of the things that I trained for beforehand was to be ready to turn around. I was interested to summit Everest. I was interested to climb Everest, but I wasn't interested to die on Everest. So I was willing to climb and not summit. That was an okay result.
Okay. Yep.
And I didn't want to be so focused to put my life at risk. That wasn't
Not the summit, managing summit fever.
Exactly. So I had some experience saying no and turning around,
Right.
and trusting in my guide. So if my guide had told me, Sam, it's time to turn around, I would have turned around. Instead, it was a discussion. So it was kind of my lead guide, Lucas Furtenbach. I think he respected my ability to understand myself, and he looked at the situation. We talked about it. He said, Sam, this is the type of time we start talking about it.
Yeah.
And the mitigating factor is that we have oxygen and we have a lot of support. So I had 2 Sherpa with me. So ultimately what we said is, let's walk to the base of the Lhotse face together and see how I feel. If I feel good, I'll keep going. If I feel bad, we'll turn up the oxygen, turn around and go down.
Because it's unusual. Well, first thing is, so that conversation's all happening outside, geared up, on the mountain. You're not in your tent, you're not resting, you've not just woken up having slept on oxygen for a bit. That's all happening outside. Which, and the reason I say that is you don't have many conversations on Everest, right? It's a heads down, goggles on, mask on, gear on, steady plod in a direction. So how close do you think you were to that conversation being a little bit different?
I mean, I think I was razor's edge.
Right.
And the next step was kind of this miraculous thing where I start going up the Lhotse face, and I think I had done the right training. So I did a lot of training. I did everything by the book, and I actually recovered on the way up.
You are probably the only person that has said that sentence about climbing on Everest. It usually gets worse.
It was to the extent that the next day, so it was about 1 a.m. the next morning where I got hungry and I started eating, and that was good. But the next day, for whatever reason, the Sherpa and I were kind of out of the front, and one of the guides said, "Oh, you guys are ready? Just go." So we got off a few minutes before, and because we weren't in the group, we were able to pick off people going up the Lhotse face. Yeah. And I finished about 2.5 hours ahead of the group. So it was this massive turnaround.
Massive. Yeah.
And this is one of the lessons, I think, is that what do we learn from that? So sometimes there's this fallacy, and I see it a lot in the West, where we look at somebody who's been successful and said, oh, everything they did must have been right.
Absolutely. Right? And I'm going to move to the camera as you say this, because I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, and I don't want this to turn off.
And so, but there's a lot of people who actually fail upwards. Yeah. Right? You can, for whatever reason, just be riding a wave and fail upwards. And then we sometimes learn the wrong lesson about the way somebody behaved, that, oh, it was his behavior that got them there. And so there's a similar thing here with Everest. So I summited Everest.
Yeah.
So therefore, this was the right decision. But was it the right decision? Like how do you know that, right? Again, life is very contingent. What if I hadn't gotten better? What if I gotten sick and done well? And what I've done is I've created a story in my head that supports my decision. And that's what we always do.
Yeah.
We have this kind of confirmation bias. Well, I summited, so it was right. So therefore, for all these reasons, it was the right decision. I can talk you through them in a lot of detail. And maybe it was right, but it's very important to have some humility and be humble and say, you know what? It might not have been right. That might have been, maybe it was actually a better decision to actually turn around and go down. But we don't know that for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important lesson. I think that comes out of mountaineering is to really look at risk and try and understand it at a deeper level, and not just look at the immediate, hey, is this okay or not?
Yeah. Or have I been successful or not? Because that's the other thing. I think, to come back and rightly celebrate. Mm-hmm. There's some vivid memories on Everest. One was feeling bad about celebrating when I got back down, because at least half the people in the tent had turned around and not been successful. So it's like, how do you celebrate in front of others? And to be honest, although I was happy that I had summited, because it meant I wasn't going to have to come back another year and try again and, invest time and money and effort. I was done on my first attempt. That was going on. But also, how close you were to having the exact opposite result. Yeah. Right. I mean, I climbed past a dead guy who was still on the ropes, who nobody passed him in 6 days by the time we had got there because the weather had been bad. So how tight success and failure were, how close those two things were to each other. And it could have been, to your point, feeling terrible at Camp 2 and vomiting, and how close that was to the exact opposite result. It wasn't, they weren't a long way apart.
And I think, how do you take those lessons into account in life? Sometimes when you fail in life, you just need to move on, right? Yeah. That it's not necessarily you failing at a personal level, that could have been a very different outcome. And, I see this all the time with Silk Road, where sometimes I think it's almost done, and I have to say, well, maybe it's not done, and don't beat yourself up, move forward. Another way I've looked at this is also when I recruit people. Yeah. You don't always need to look for somebody who succeeded in everything. You can look past that and look for somebody who sometimes worked through adversity. Look at their intelligence, look at their decision making, and sometimes provide a path for them to have that second chance. And you'll sometimes find amazing people who can do amazing things. They just happen to have had, let's say, the wrong contingencies go against them. I found that to be kind of an interesting way of looking for talent sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's going back to my comment about you at the start of this around, your track of success early on, school and Bain and MBA and this, that's a sort of track of ease and no failure in some, I mean, I don't want to suppose that, but that's what it could feel like. It's just like, okay, this is all laid out. But then to go make those difficult decisions and live in the places that you lived and do the jobs that you do, and then mining in Afghanistan, and then, climbing Everest, and then Afghan peaks. So there's a litany of ridiculously challenging things that you've kind of thrown yourself at. And it goes back to the experiences that we have. I talk about this a lot, is again, in recruiting, is I'm interested in varied experiences, and some of those experiences can be massive failures for people. In the leadership space, people will tell you all the time, I learned the most when this went horribly wrong, right? Because it's painful. I have the scars. I'm going to try to not make the same mistake twice, etc. And I think that's sometimes missing. You actually hear at places like Harvard and stuff that some students really struggle from a well-being standpoint when they get there, because to have gotten there, they had to be in the top 1% for their entire lives. And then they get there, and all of a sudden they could be in the 99th percent.
Right.
Right. You know, and they struggle with that. You know, people really struggle with failure and not being the best and not always winning and so on. That's why I'm trying to work into my kids as well. You know, it's
and a lot of that does come from a very young age.
Yeah.
So I was kind of young for my grade. And you know, in the U.S., sports is very important, and so and I was a small kid,
Right.
So I was young and small, and you learn from that failure, and that was probably part of me learning to persevere. People can learn perseverance in different ways, but me learning to persevere was, you know, a lot of the failures I experienced as a, you know, also ran in sports, which is a great set of lessons. It's a great way to learn how to keep on pushing yourself.
Yeah, and I find the outdoors is a great playground for failure because you never know what's gonna change.
Right.
You know, relate that back to the business. I do a bit of a talk around resilience based off of the Everest experience. And one of my early questions for people is, what changes? So if you think about climbing Everest, even though none of you have ever done it before, which is usually the case, what changes? And people will reel out, you know, the weather, your health, you know, like you say, the vomiting. No, they'll reel off a whole bunch of stuff that changes. Usually the last thing that they think about is mindset, how your mind changes. One day you can wake up and think, oh, I'm going to do this today. And other days you wake up going, oh my God, why am I here? So the brain game that you play. And then I ask folks, what stays the same? So when you climb Everest, what stays the same? And they're like, well, I can tell you what stays the same. The height of Everest stays the same. The angle of the mountain stays the same. Usually the temperature at the summit fluctuates a little bit, but it's usually around -40. So, you know, there are many things on the mountain that stay the same. So my question for you is, when you think about the Afghan peaks, Silk Road mining, the roles that you've had, what are the things that have stayed the same for you that have really helped you? And then what are the things that you do to manage change?
Yeah, I think the things that have stayed the same are that, you know, you need to have a certain base. So your family stays the same, and kind of making sure that you're taking care of your family along the way. That needs to somehow always be a part of it. What can change is, for me, my life perspective, right? So there was a stage early on where my identity was part of these companies and working as hard as I could to kind of live that American dream where I can have the resources to do certain things. And then what I guess a big change was saying, you know what, I now have enough to live a middle-class life no matter what happens, and I don't need to go to that next step. That's not important for me. Instead, I want to redeploy. And so that for me has been one of the things that's changed a lot, is moving away from one identity to this other identity.
Yeah.
And it's also been a challenge though, because when you're used to your identity being so tied up with your career, and that happens quite a lot in the U.S. People ask you, what do you do?
Yeah, that's right. That's question number two. Question number one is, where do you live?
And it's not just your identity when you meet people, but it's your daily routine.
Yeah.
And so there's something affirming to being the leader of an organization and feeling needed and important. And it can be quite lonely when you start leading these other ventures from your home office. So I moved back to the U.S. so that my daughter could be in the same public school I went to, so my wife could be comfortable being back in the U.S. And so suddenly I don't have the affirmation of leading a team of 300 people with global operations and listings and all these important things. And I have to then push myself in my home office to do things. So that was a very big change for me that was difficult for my summit of doing these new startups. Yeah. So what's next? Obviously you haven't. Obviously, Afghanistan with the mining business is ongoing, and Afghan Peaks is ongoing. We should talk about your aim, I think, for 2025 and climbing the highest mountain in Afghanistan, if possible. So those are kind of the two things. So on the business side, if I'm honest, large-scale mining went quiet for Afghanistan until people understood the lay of the land. But there are a number of interested parties who are ready to work with me to now take Silk Road forward as a platform. So that's super exciting, is that after a couple of years, if I think about it, what was one of the reasons I probably climbed Everest? Well, probably because Afghanistan was on pause.
Right.
So
you needed the next challenge.
I needed to keep myself busy, right?
Yeah.
And so I was able to do that, and now maybe the environment's right for Silk Road to really move forward. So that's very exciting. And then the other thing is, as you mentioned, what's next for Afghan Peaks, and for me as a climber, is to do that mountain that I really want to do, is No Shock.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is, I'm working with a filmmaker named Bakhtash Ahadi. He worked on Retrograde. He's won some awards on that. He's an Afghan American with a similar background to mine in terms of growing up in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Is to do a film about climbing No Shock and the refugee experience, and hopefully do it on skis.
Yeah.
So that's part of what's fun today is
we skied up here. Yeah, we skinned up.
Getting comfortable with skins and climbing skin mountains. So if I can, because No Shock is actually, I believe, the first 7,000 meter plus peak to have been skied.
Okay, when was it last climbed? Do you know?
So it was climbed a few years back. So people have been climbing it, and there have been some Afghans who climbed it. But I think it'll be important to kind of let people know that Afghanistan's open for climbing again.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of worry when there's governmental change, and just to send this message to people, hey, let's come back and start climbing Afghanistan again. I think we'll send that message. And doing it skiing, I think it's just adds a lot of fun to the adventure.
Yeah, to the adventure. So I should have thought of this earlier. I'm gonna introduce you to Jimmy Chin.
Oh, that'll be wonderful.
Because I met him January last year or the year before.
Okay.
In Jackson Hole. He was speaking at a session I was running for a client. In fact, it was the client who I just filmed 2 weeks ago.
Oh, really?
Mike Novogratz, who has a place out in Jackson, and got Jimmy in to talk. So they've become friends. So through him, we can make that connection, because he's clearly well connected for documentary filmmaking. Yeah. Interesting. So what do you think the training's going to be?
I think I'll need to repeat a lot of the same Everest training in terms of just being strong uphill and having the cardio in place.
Yeah.
But I'll need to do more ski mountaineering. So I think Jackson is going to be important.
Yeah.
I think kind of climbing and skiing down those peaks around there is great training. And then I'm going to just listen and learn. I don't want to assume. I need to talk with some of the other guys who've done it and be ready for it.
It's very funny. I've been stood behind the camera for the last 15 minutes watching it, because it kept switching off, and when I'm stood there watching, it doesn't switch off.
There you go.
So I'm wondering if there's a sensor on the back end of this thing that's not picking us up.
It's a watch pot that's going to boil.
Oh, it's crazy. So and the plan for the documentary, obviously, build a team and get as much publicity for it as possible, and continue to push tourism into Afghanistan.
Exactly, and Afghan Peaks would be the beneficiary of the film as well. So if it's economically successful, even more that we can do with skiing and avalanche safety.
Yeah, absolutely, awesome. Okay, I'm gonna round this up, as it's starting to get a little bit chilly around the leg region, which is strange. My body is warm, but my legs are a little cold.
I didn't put on my puffies. I got the one thin layer, so I'm with you on that.
We don't even know the route from here, so we managed to
doing some route
skin
finding.
up. It's whether we go that way, or we're definitely not going this way.
No?
I'm not so sure. Or we could go back the way we came, but I quite fancy this way. See what we see.
Okay.
Sam, that was awesome. Thanks, buddy.
I appreciate it.